Welcome to People Are the Point. I'm your host, Mark Concannon. Let's talk about the people. Hello, I'm Mark Concannon, your host for People Are the Point. Join me today, I talked to Shane Spraggs. He literally wrote the book on remote work. He consults with organizations trying to make the most of the hybrid and remote workforce. Also, as a husband, a father, and a part-time lawn bowler. We're going to have a little fun today. Thank you for joining me.
How to fit that into culture and execution. So where are you coming to for us today?
I am calling in from a town called Kelowna. It's in British Columbia. We are 5 hours east of Vancouver. So we're in the middle of the, I wouldn't say Rockies, but there's a bunch of foothills here. It's a lovely area.
So you were a little omniscient seeing this coming, that somebody got started with a lot of the remote work evangelism before COVID. What kind of had it catch your attention in the first place? What drew you to this path?
I've always just been someone who takes interest in what's the best way to be productive and get work done. And what the pandemic showed us was that working from home is an option. I think it's interesting when we actually look at the timeline. I think we were on the verge of some technical improvements at the time, anyways. Zoom was already a thing. It was already becoming fairly popular. It was already starting to take place of the place of phone calls and certainly conference calls. I don't know about you, but before the pandemic, and I've had a number of really awful daily stand-ups around a conference bridge, and it's just not possible. You listen to a bunch of people talking on the other side of the phone, you just can't pick up at what's happening. And Zoom kind of helps a little bit of that. You can get some facial recognition, and you can point to things. You can tell when people are like ready to jump in and interrupt the conversation, and that really helps with the conversation quite a bit. And I think we were there anyways between that and instant messaging. The tech community had Slack for many years ahead of that, but Slack and MS Teams started becoming popular in non-tech areas, marketing and operations and non-tech businesses. Yeah, pandemic just expedited things for us quite and told us that working from home and maybe not taking that 2-hour commute is a thing. It really displayed to the larger community that working from home was possible and an option. And that's really where things have landed these days. There was a whole time when lots of companies were proclaiming that we're going to stay remote. This is it. We're going to be remote for us. And then, we all know that, around spring of 2023, we started seeing lots of return to the office news articles, and even those petered out in the fall. It didn't take long 6 months before people started saying, maybe we shouldn't go back to the office. There's some not so good things here either. And I think it gave a lot of people pause to start thinking about some of the more important fundamentals about work. What are we doing here? Like, what are we trying to achieve, and how do we measure progress, and how do we get the most out of people, all the while not robbing them of their well-being and their work-life balance, and that recognizing that maybe being on this planet just to work isn't the best choice. So there's a lot of those sort of cultural changes outside of business happened as well, and you started seeing a lot of people, with there was a few movements around where people were working to rule basically, and only working for the time that they were hired for and not working extra. And I know I had people in my social group who stopped working where they were and picked up new like bakery jobs and other things that they wanted to do as opposed to what they were doing. And so I think that's probably the longer term impact of the whole pandemic. It's, hey, we can work from home, and there's a reason why we want to work from home. Working from home is the solution to the problem, which the problem is we don't really have a healthy relationship with work in the first place.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. We've definitely seen, we do a lot of work with enterprise clients, but we've definitely seen them pushing for, if not 100% return to work, very close, right? A little bit of a hybrid, 2 days off maybe, but it can't be Friday and Monday, right? So there'll be all these rules around it. From my perspective, what it feels like a lot of times is it's just the cultural shift hasn't happened to your point, value a healthier relationship with work. and respect that people. I don't know. For us, we saw like a 30% increase in productivity in our teams when we went remote.
Yeah.
So do you feel like it's industry? Is it company size? Where do you think it fits best? And what's holding us back from understanding this value?
That's a great question. And so I'll start by just it was going through the enterprise side of things, and it makes complete sense to me that they went back to the office. When you really look at what it takes to run a remote company, I say in the book, that it's not about different management practices. It's about better management practices. All the things you need to be a good manager are on the blogs and business books out there already. You just have to follow it. And unfortunately, most managers become managers because someone taps them on the shoulder and say, "Hey, you're doing great as an individual contributor. Let's see how you manage people," and that's it. There's no training involved whatsoever, and that just leaves you in a position where you can't manage in an office, or worse, remotely. And so these larger companies were faced with a fairly significant challenge where they have a large group of their staff, their the HR managers and the executive team, who really don't know how to run a remote business. And now, do you train them to become more remote savvy and really work to shift your culture, or do you pull everybody in and possibly lose a few people? So it really became a bit more of I think a risk assessment, and it was cheap for them to say, okay, you know what, we had a good time going remote. We're all going to go back to the office now. We're going to go back to the way things were, because we can't afford to train everyone how to work remotely properly. And then from the mid-sized businesses, I don't think they had the luxury to do that, and it became more of a compromise. Like, hey, well, most of the people on our team are local, so what if we met in the middle? Come back to work for 3 days a week, and then like you said, there's some rules around it. At the foundation of this, though, is I don't think companies are really looking at how is it they're measuring how a person is being productive in the office in the first place. And I'm sure you get this sort of this placebo effect in the office because you can see people at their desk. But there's been tons of research and reports around things like you only get maybe 6 hours, probably 5 hours a day of productivity. What are you doing with the other 3 hours? That's a lot of time. Well, you're taking breaks, you're going to the office, your bathroom, you're having a longer lunch, you may be arriving a little bit later, leaving a little earlier, and these things start to chew into the productivity during the day. And then looking at a small business, this is where I see the next wave is going to really change things. Is if you're starting a business these days, at what point do you say, hey, let's get an office? Probably at least a $5,000 a month investment at in between rent and desks and all the paper for the equipment, printer, toner, all that stuff. At what point does that become like, hey, I rather get an office that's going to anchor us to this geographical location instead of hiring somebody maybe in Croatia for half the price to do the work we need to get done. And we're just going to start seeing businesses from the ground up be more remote and more flexible, and be more remote first, right? We'll have probably there'll be some people who work from the office in some of those cases, but generally the next Amazon, next Microsoft, next Google is being created in someone's basement right now.
And so we see so much. Not only can they do it in the basement, not only can they do remote, but then when they do need office space, they can go share. And so
Yeah.
we work maybe a little early to the game in certain ways, and maybe over invested in their real estate in terms of what the experience was. Now that's being bought up by shared working environment companies again, because the demand hasn't disappeared. It's just maybe the price point was off.
Exactly.
So along these lines, think back across your career. You've done development, operations, now working on empowering remote work. If you back up to the parts where you're inside of the organizations and you had to do the execution or oversee the execution, have you found there was a lot of opportunity there that you wish you'd go back and change more of the remote work?
Yeah, I as a software developer, when I started, it's clear, I was a software developer 20 years ago. It's been a long time. I cut my teeth on C++, so just to set the expectation there. But I knew then that you needed focus time. We used to call it flocus, right? Flow, focus, and it was really well known that if you interrupt a software developer while they're coding, they lose 15 minutes at best, right? And that distraction was already a problem in these large Costco-sized businesses that Apple and Google were creating. The whole open office concept was a real bust from a lot of productivity standpoints. There's lots of evidence to support that. But again, that was yet another effort for someone to cut costs and make assumptions about what makes people productive. Oh, we're all going to be in a room together and we'll be able to collaborate. And we're like, okay, well, collaboration's good for coming up with the ideas, but not for executing on it. Execution is about 80% of it, right? You have to figure out what you're going to do first. Sure, you do that in an office, get together in person for that, fantastic. When you know what you're doing, scurry off to your desk somewhere, close the door, and get the work done. And what we actually have learned since then as well is that, so yeah, back to your original question, point. I knew very early on that there was ingredients to someone being productive, and that included, giving them time to work uninterrupted, making sure they had enough rest. The illusion of having a 60-hour work week, is just it's an illusion. You might get 40 hours of work, out of that, but the other 20 hours are wasted somewhere, and then they're tired for the next week. And so the stuff that happened with the pandemic is just going to shine a light on it. We had a lot of evidence about this before. We were talking about the 4-day work week for years before the pandemic started, and because of the reason that we know that people need more time to relax and recharge in order to produce the value that they're supposed to produce for a business.
Yeah, I think you just mentioned the 60-hour work week. Unfortunately, I've lived through being part of it, and the challenge was we actually got maybe 60 hours out of it, but I sacrificed my personal life. And I was
Yeah.
sleeping when I should have been spending time with family or friends or doing other things that allowed me to emotionally recharge before, to your point, I dive right back to the next week. So while there might have been 60 hours of work, to your point, productivity wasn't at 100% for all 60. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I had a similar situation. I worked at Disney for a number of years, and I'm not trying to call Disney out on this, but we had, I have pictures from my family album where I'm in the picture, and I can't remember the event. I have no idea when this happened, and just my young daughters are in there. That's time I should have been, imprinting on my memory rather than photos, right? And it's unfortunately true to many people in this world. And then along with that, 60-hour work week, that's in the office, doesn't count the hours a day people are commuting, right? There's only so many podcasts and languages you could learn in your car for that to make back that time.
Couldn't agree more. Well, Shane, that's part of why I was excited to have you on our pod today. That's the whole point, is what you just mentioned. It's great for us to work, and it's great for us to build our careers and our network for the purposes of, but the people in the background, our daughters, our wives, our spouses, our friends, our parents, are so much of what we tell ourselves why we're doing these things, right? I'm trying to make sure I've got the college fund for my daughter. I'm trying to make sure we have a good home to live in, and then we're never there. So I just want to reinforce a little bit. So I know you talked about your daughters when they were younger. Maybe you don't have the memories that you wish you could have imprinted, like the photos of you presently there, but not necessarily the time spent. Now you've written this book about the power of remote and obviously reinforcing all these messages, but there's a balance too, right? Around, because when I am home, I have to make sure, I think of COVID, that was the real culture shock. I was off the road 100%. I travel a lot for the job. My daughter and I are sharing a dining room table for her to do her second grade schoolwork and for me to do conference calls. And so we had to find that balance. And I know in your book, you do a lot of talking that's really powerful around the way to build a culture and the right management skills and the right people and picking them for those purposes. But talk a little about as well, finding that balance between now you're doing the work out of your life, right? And you have to create new boundaries. What are your thoughts there, and how do you do that for yourself?
Yeah, and I'll be the first to say remote work's not for everyone. And obviously the pandemic was an extremely interesting time and rare time in our lives where we had to share the kitchen table with our kids, because they were also not at school and they had things to do. When we hire remote people, one of the things we look for is what environment do they have to work out of. If they're calling from a kitchen table in a small studio flat, and they have a family or roommates there, it's something they're not going to be able to change. And so it's a real concern and consideration for anyone hiring somebody, because that's something that's going to impact their ability to be productive. For myself personally, I've got a secondary room. I got the luxury of having a large enough house where I can dedicate a whole room to my office, and not everyone can. Now, if you still want to hire that individual, there's nothing stopping the business from investing in a hot swap desk somewhere in town, and they can get back to, they can have that bit of a socialization with people they work with, and they can have that separation between home and work, and probably find a place that's closer to their house than maybe your office would be, in a larger city. So there's some considerations there. And and we talk a lot in the book about making your home office productive, and you have to treat it like a proper office. You're spending hours a day there. For me, it is recognizing that you are on the job for a certain number of hours, and you're getting paid to produce value for the business. And as long as you're producing that value on a regular basis and making your commitments, it shouldn't really matter to the business when or how you do that. Now, some of that time requires you to be available to collaborate with other people on your team, and I strongly advise companies to set up collaboration hours. What times during the day does everyone have to be online so that we can talk to each other and be available for each other? And I would suggest that's a smaller subset than your office hours. So say it's between 10 and 2 or something like that. And then that gives people some flexibility around the time. And if they're away for that time, they can say, hey, they can post a message saying, I'm just off to a doctor's appointment. That should not impose any concern around whether they're being productive or not. It's no different than being at the office and getting up and walking around the hallway with a coffee and socializing with the other people. And I'm guilty of that, and everyone's guilty of that. When you're in an office, you lose and waste time as well. So why couldn't I go upstairs and say hi to my daughters as they come home from school, and then go back to work for the next hour or so? I typically work from about 8 to 5:30 during the day, and I can definitely say I get my 8 hours out of that. But it's more fluid than you would normally get in an office.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So as you look at these pieces and the way we're watching everything develop, I think you have a daughter in university right now. What do you think her work world's going to look like as she moves into this space? Will we have better support in the near future for the mixed environment? Or are we going to continue to see this pressure? I want to see you in a seat so I know you're working.
Well, that's an interesting question as well. I would absolutely want her to go into an office at least for the first 5 years of her career. Assuming that there's a career for her. All these changes with the business, we don't know where AI is evolving relatively quickly here, and who knows, maybe we'll be in that that blissful Garden of Eden that they keep talking about. we focus on creative things, but there's a lot to be learned from working alongside other people that I think someone who is, I take it for granted. I worked in an office for 20 years before I went remote, and I brought with me all the best practices of how to deal with people, how to manage conflict, how to manage my time, how to ask for questions and ask for help, how to be visible to people, reach out and ask questions. And these are things that you have to learn by doing. You can tell people in a blog post or in a book that this is necessary, but until you actually sit down and actually force, you're actually in that environment, it's not really the same. So I'm a big proponent on asking on new employees getting their in-office experience so they can be better employees for the rest of their career.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I think you touched on something else, obviously, that's core to all this. What does productivity mean? And I think too often, especially in the enterprise side, we see them measured by maybe some sort of dashboard they publish for a program, or a VP feeling like they've had a lot of conversations, but none of that really measures the output. That's more of a feeling, and it's more of an emotional drive for that individual to make sure that they're in power, or they've been in a spot to drive something. So I think maybe is that a core part, is what is it we're trying to say is production,
Yeah.
productivity, and do we measure it properly?
Yeah. The answer is probably no. No, most people don't measure it properly, but it's actually fairly straightforward. If your business has goals or objectives, KPIs, and or OKRs, and those are broken. Your yearly OKRs are broken down into quarterly OKRs for your department, and out of those, typically a project are born. From those projects, you have tasks or stories, depending if you're following agile or not, and those are measurable. You can, in an ideal world, the individuals are assigned the work, or at least they're made aware that the work is theirs to do, and there's a point where they say they can get it done by a certain time, and their manager either coaches them on changing that time or accepts that time, and then they get the work done in that time. That's productivity. And for some roles like sales and marketing and customer support, there are some other KPIs that are just known and aware. We should, you have to sell a certain number of sales each month. You have to bring in a certain number of leads or handle a certain number of calls in this sort of time. And those are easy metrics to capture and be able to measure someone's productivity against. And there's industry standards along with that. Hey, a typical salesperson should be able to do this much work in close this many leads in a month. And it's as simple as that. So and I've always found that whether it's in the office or not, when someone's not meeting their expectations, even if you're not documenting them as thoroughly as you should be, and you don't have everything in Asana, you don't have a dashboard that measures down to the task which one's where, you kind of know when people aren't meeting their commitments. But what's different is that I find in the office, people tend to deal with it differently, and there's people check in on it more frequently because they're reminded, oh, this individual is working on that thing they said they would do. They might walk back to the desk and ask them how they're doing on it. There might be a little bit of public shaming because they're not hitting their deadline. Remotely, people just tend to be left to their own devices for far too long, and that's where the bad management comes in place. Where a good manager will know that they've set the expectation with their direct report to hit a date, and might check in throughout the week before the date gets hit, and then helps them with it if they know it's not going to get hit, right? So we had a process at Vertira called Days of the Week. We're very simple, extra layer of administration you can add on top of any team, which very simply keeps track of all the tasks and all the things that people said they would do, all the action items that came out of meetings, conversations, get added to a list, and then on a weekly basis on Monday, you would review that with each team member. Say, here's the things you said you'd do this week, and on Tuesday and Wednesday you'd follow up with them. Thursday you'd write up you'd be aware of any risks of things not being hit, and then on Friday you'd publicly shame anyone who didn't hit it. You'd publish a list. Here's everything you got done, and here's who missed it. It kind of gets back to that in-office approach to put a bit of peer pressure on people to hit their targets.
Well, and related to the peer pressure and accountability as you're describing, that's where on-camera interaction can really drive a lot of the facial recognition and connecting with the person and making sure you understand the emotion under the answer. But also it brings around to, I think in the book you talked about, level of dress code expectation based on the person you're acting with, down you can be more casual if it's internal. So are PJs okay when it's internal calls? Like where's the line stop?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think there's definitely a more casual decorum for people who work at home. And in fact, there's studies that show that people buy less clothing when they work from home. So they're probably recycling the same thing over and over again. Obviously, you're only from the top waist up. Personally, I just can't be productive in PJs. I've tried it a couple times, and I find that getting, and this is more of a mindset for me, and I won't necessarily want to impose on others, but I find that getting ready for work is an important aspect of being ready for work. So, and part of that is putting pants on and making sure you have the right, you're putting, maybe you iron a shirt, or you have a routine that you go through. So it's not there's some separation, and that's just a good, healthy practice from a mental health standpoint, because otherwise it starts to bleed into each other. And one of the things I'll lead in this a bit. One of the things we look for when we hire people is we look for a healthy social life. So because you don't tend to get the social side of things at the office, and that's not to say there's no camaraderie or relationships remotely. It's just different. It's just a bit less social and a bit less friendly. And so we look for people who have a healthy social life outside the office, because that's where they get their social fix. They're part of a club, or they have a hobby, or they belong to a sport, so they whatnot. And that tends to offset and provide a bit more structure to the day, so they're not always sitting behind their desk or being at home. One of the big challenges over the pandemic was we were stuck in an office, in a house for 2 months straight before, I don't know about you, but we didn't go outside for 2 months because we thought we didn't know what this was, right? And that it turned out to be, it was pretty bad the first rounds, but and now, as it's just a bad flu now. But yeah, the first 2 months were different than,
Yeah,
but yeah, you have to get out of the house.
it makes a lot of sense. I agree. Well, you mentioned hobbies. So talking about lawn bowling, I understand you're a champion.
We didn't quite make the championship. It was a casual league. So a good example. We have a lawn bowling club here in town. I'm probably 20 years too young for me to get a membership to it. But they host every year. They host a series of events where it's 5 days, 5 weeks in a row on Thursday, and you just get together and you do a few rounds, and it's very casual. And again, it's a good example of getting out of the house and having something to do and be proud of. And we came in second, didn't quite finish
That's great.
first place, but it was a close game.
That's great. And so as you've been focused on the remote work, obviously that creates a lot of opportunity for productivity and work-life balance. Are you making those new memories now with the family that you feel like maybe you weren't giving yourself time for before? Has that changed for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel more connected to the kids than ever because they're more around, and I get to, like I said, I get to greet them. I get to help them drive to school if they miss the bus. And I'm not saying it's something I want to do all the time, but I will take them to school, and it's something I wouldn't have been able to do beforehand. And we get out and do more things on a regular basis with family and friends, and that we wouldn't have otherwise, especially when you're working 60 hours a week. And you add a commute to that. I couldn't possibly take an hour out of my morning, an hour out of my evening right now, my schedule. I don't know where I would take it from. And so I'm thankful for that, just to have time to, sometimes just watching TV is all I need to do, is just watch a couple hours and just decompress, and then I'm ready to go the next day.
And it's amazing. I lived in Los Angeles for a number of years and had a 2-hour commute each way into the office. To your point, I don't know where that 4 hours went. Like now, there's so much more available time and so much more productive at the same time. It's been a huge windfall. Yeah, completely agree. Well, Shane, anything else you wanted to touch on today before we wrap up?
Oh, I guess I'll throw in a pitch for my book. There we go. Power
Please.
Remote. It's it's at the ready here. Yeah, it came out in February 2023 last year, and we've had a good response to it. It was Amazon bestseller in one of the categories for a bit there. So feel free to pick it up if you also available. We learned on Spotify as well. So if you have a Spotify Pro account, you can listen to the book, which is great. And thank you so much for having me on your show, Mark. And I look forward to having this podcast live.
Absolutely, Shane. And really quickly, just to back up the detail of your book, as an aspiring business author myself, I'm started on something I haven't got done. I really love that every page has a lot of content and real information, and the stories tie so well. So I really enjoyed the book. I read it myself as well. So great job.
Thanks.
On that.
Appreciate that, Mark. Great.
Absolutely. For the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.